Hello and welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. Thanks especially to Jason and Adam, who both recently became patrons. We really do appreciate it, and all of our patrons. If you want to find out more about the benefits of being a patron of the podcast, just pop along to Patreon, patreon.com/The History Network. The historynetwork.org podcast, season 28, episode 5, The Ubiquity of the Cretan Archer in Ancient Warfare, part 2. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray Darm is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand, living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Combat 40, Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior. Alexander confronts the Achaemenids, 334 to 331 BC, from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. One thing to note in regard to Cretans is that when they are mentioned in our sources, they are always referred to as Cretan archers or just Cretans, or occasionally just archers, and we must work out from the contexts that they were Cretan. One such example is Plutarch's Cleomenes 6.3, which talks of Cretans, but later at 21.3 they are Cretan archers. Cretans are not usually associated with any other type of arms, although Plutarch has Pyrrhus's horse wounded by a Cretan javelin. Thus we don't find Cretan hoplites mentioned or any other kind of Cretan troops, reinforcing their identity as archers par excellence. There must, of course, have been other types of troops on Crete. When we read of Cretan power struggles, we cannot imagine that these encounters were simply between groups of archers. There too, however, Polybius seems to be operating on the assumption that some mercenary archer contingents are implied. For example, the Polyrrhenians and their allies sent to Philip and the Achaeans 500 Cretans, while the Gnossians had a little earlier sent 1,000 to the Aetolians, and both these Cretan forces continued to take part in the present war. A suggestion based on Plato is that there were Cretan peltasts and slingers too, and perhaps a very small number of cavalry. In the realm of mercenary troops used in the armies of Greece, Macedonia, Sicilian and Roman forces, however, there are only archers. Therefore, if Cretans are mentioned, it should be understood that they were archers. The situation of archers being equated with Cretans is more complicated, but it too has validity. Another temptation is that when a Cretan is named in foreign military service without anything further to go on, he should be considered to be connected with an archer contingent, usually as its commander. Polybius summarises the Cretans. Both by land and sea are irresistible in ambuscades, forays, tricks played on the enemy, night attacks, and all petty operations which require fraud, but they are cowardly and downhearted in the massed face-to-face charge of open battle. This summary suits their deployment as archers and their use as such, in addition to their use in ambushes and other activities which are borne out in the sources. Even when such activities are mentioned, however, the primary function assumed for these troops is that of archer. We now come to the historical period of the Cretan archer, when their existence as groups of mercenaries for hire is not doubted, and their presence in armies fits with our ideas about developments in warfare. Indeed, they are attested in armies all over the ancient world and from the late 5th century BCE onwards. Thucydides tells us that the Cretans were on the Athenian side providing infantry and money. Even though Thucydides does not mention them as archers here, that is what is assumed they provided. Indeed, by the time of the Sicilian expedition, the forces gathered included archers from Athens and from Crete. Thucydides tells us that this contingent was 80 strong from a total of 480 archers. There he also mentions 700 slingers, and indeed they are from Rhodes, another culture associated almost exclusively with a particular martial skill. Despite telling us that Crete was part of the Athenian alliance, Thucydides states that the Cretans in Sicily were mercenaries who ended up fighting voluntarily and for pay against the colony of Gela, which they had helped establish. Thucydides therefore gives us solid evidence of groups of Cretan archers as mercenaries hired in the late 5th century, despite the obvious desire for and appeal of mercenary work during a time of war. It is entirely possible that this practice had begun earlier on Crete. Xenophon mentions the Cretan archers in the service of Cyrus, where Clearchus, the Spartan exile, arrived with 1,000 hoplites, 800 Thracian peltasts, yet another cultural fighting style association, and 200 Cretan archers. It is unclear if there were other contingents of archers, but none are mentioned. After the defeat at Cunaxa in 401 BCE and during the March of the 10,000, both the Cretan archers and Rhodian slingers took on an important role. We are told that the Greeks suffered when harassed by Mithridates because the mounted Persian bows could outdistance the Cretan ones, and that, being light troops, they had taken positions inside the square of the march. Another translation of this phrase is that they had no armour, although it does appear that they had shields. Xenophon chose a group of 200 Rhodians who know how to use a sling to defend the march. The Rhodians were on the expedition, not as slingers. Xenophon only mentions javelin men and Cretan archers, but skill in that weapon was considered, for lack of a better term, a national trait. The same situation of assuming archery as a trait for men from Crete is not recorded in the sources, although the scenario would be the same. The Rhodian slingers could outrange the Persian slingers and most of the Persian archers. Xenophon expands upon this, telling us that the Persians used a bigger bow, but that the Cretans were able to pick up the spent Persian arrows and reuse them, and practiced long-range shooting with a high trajectory. The reuse of Persian arrows implies that the Cretan bows cannot have been too dissimilar in size. When the Greeks were in difficult terrain, Xenophon tells us that, in this type of country, the Cretans were extremely useful. Stratocles, a Cretan himself, was their commander. This recalls the training prescribed in Plato's laws. Given that the unit of 200 Rhodians were extremely useful in keeping the pursuing enemy at bay, there is no need to assume that any more than the 200 Cretan archers we know of were also present, and, what is more, that it was this relatively small number that was so effective. Their effectiveness is recalled by Alexander in Arrian's Anabasis, although we must be wary that this may have been Arrian's own invention because of his great admiration for Xenophon. The idea that the Cretan archers wore shields can be seen in Anabasis, where Xenophon tells us that a certain Mysus took 10 Cretan archers on an ambush, but their brass shields kept flashing into sight. This raises the idea of the greater versatility of the Cretan archer and the possibility that they could operate as light armed troops as well as just archers. This may also suggest a solution to the idea of Cretan youth training in peltas techniques of shield and archery. It is also possible that Cretan archers had some form of specialised light armour. Livy speaks of Critico Maximi Armetu, Cretan arms, although the phrase may simply mean they were armed with the bow. This passage also allows us to see that non-Cretans were equipped and trained in the Cretan fashion, but may still have been known as Cretan archers within the makeup of an army. Livy states that 1,500 Achaeans contributed to the army of Publius Licinius in 171 BCE, but that they were mostly equipped with Cretan weaponry, Critico Maximi Armetu. The idea in Polybius that the Cretans were cowardly in the face-to-face charge of open battle perhaps implies that they were sometimes in that position, perhaps because they were equipped with shields and not simply archers. This may correspond with the flexible training implied in Plato, the idea that groups of Cretans or any other mercenary force identified by name, Terentines, Thracians, Rhodians and others, may not have been from Crete but from other locations and simply trained in the Cretan manner, creates a complicated picture. Whilst it may represent the reality of units identified as Cretan, we certainly know from named commanders that there remained a Cretan connection and probably a corps of actual Cretan archers, even if large numbers of the unit were drawn from elsewhere. At the Battle of Nemea in 394, Xenophon tells us that there were 300 Cretan archers on the side of the Spartans. The presence of Cretan archers in Spartan armies during this time can be assumed relatively safely to be a constant, since Xenophon mentions them plundering Nauplier in 388 rather than being present to shoot down the Boeotian cavalry outside Argos. The appeal of plunder was, of course, to remain a common problem for all employers of mercenary forces. Another Cretan we can assume to have been an archer in the service of Sparta is the individual who warned Agesilaus of the approach of Epaminondas's forces towards an undefended Sparta in 362. Agesilaus had probably had good service from Cretan archers in the east and so continued to use them in mainland Greece. They must have been considered both cost-effective and a good investment, for their presence seems to have been continuous. Since Clearchus was already using Cretan archers in 401, we can assume Spartan armies had an even longer history of using them, although explicit evidence is lacking. It should be noted, however, that Diodorus calls these troops Cretan runners. Diodorus's account differs here from others we have, and we should still probably associate these Cretan runners with mercenary Cretan archers in Agesilaus's army. Plato has Cleinias describe Cretans as runners at the same time as archers. In 362 they were certainly diligent and carried out their orders efficiently. Xenophon tells us that the king offered prizes for the most efficient archers along with other units, best riders in cavalry, fittest heavy infantry. We can be sure that these archers who spent their time shooting at the mark included a large number of Cretans. The 500 Cretans sent to Philip by the Polyrenians are mentioned again, along with 300 slingers, his Macedonians, and the levy of Epriotes. It is clear these Cretan forces are meant to be understood as archers. Polybius names the forces taken by Philip to Corinth as consisting of 3,000 of his brazen shield hoplites, 2,000 peltasts, 300 Cretans, and about 400 of his horse guards. Some of these Cretans, who had left their ranks and were prowling about in search of plunder, betrayed Philip's presence. This searching for plunder suggests further they were mercenaries and reinforces that they were archers. We also find several references to Cretan archers used by Alexander the Great, who seems to have taken advantage of their skill and versatility. The first mention of them in Arrian's Anabasis, however, reinforces the idea that when our sources mention simply archers, they can imply that specifically Cretan archers are meant. Attacking the Thebans in 335, Alexander brought his forces to aid Perdiccas. He ordered the archers and Agrianians to run out in advance behind the palisade. The troops who had broken in with him, along with Alexander's archers, hemmed the Thebans into the sunken road. Eurybatus, the Cretan commander of the archers, fell with about 70 of his men. We are originally only told of Alexander's archers, but later in the same passage their Cretan commander is named, and it would seem logical to assume that they were Cretan archers, or perhaps an archer unit trained in the Cretan manner with a Cretan commander and a corps of Cretan veterans. Alexander also took 1,000 archers and Agrianians with him into Asia, but it is clear these were Cretans, a huge sign of the quality and value for money such mercenaries provided. At the Battle of Issus, Arrian tells us that the Cretan archers were posted on the left wing with the Thracians and commanded by Sitalsus. Some of these mercenary archers were then transferred to the right wing to effect the outflanking of the Persian line. Alexander clearly used his Cretan archers in combination with other troop types to achieve battlefield aims, a literal use of combined arms tactics. The archers, with some Agrianians, sallied forth and dislodged the enemy from the heights. These Thracians/Agrianians are another specialist light-armed unit from Thrace armed with javelins, and were clearly paired by Alexander with his Cretan archers. According to Curtius Rufus, at Issus, a force posted in front of the phalanx consisted of slingers interspersed with archers, the Thracians and the Cretans, who were also light-armed. This seems to reinforce Xenophon's idea that the Cretans could be used for more than just archery. At Gaugamela, Diodorus names the Cretan archers in the formation, and Curtius Rufus has Cretan archers in the rear division to prevent the encirclement of his army. Later, in 326 BCE, Alexander ensured he had all his archers and therefore must have included his Cretans accompanying the force with which he entered Porus's territory in India. Curtius Rufus records a curious anecdote whereby the Cretan archers were entrusted by Alexander to put to death a Persian in Alexander's army of dubious loyalty, a certain Sicinis. Curtius records that a Cretan soldier gave this Sicinis a letter purportedly from Nabazanes, the Persian commander, and when he did not report this to Alexander, he was killed by the Cretans as the army marched on, no doubt on the king's orders. In 331 BCE, Ombrion, a Cretan, had been appointed as the commander of the archers. The recording of the names of the mostly Cretan commanders of the various Cretan archer contingents in Xenophon and Arrian constitutes a roll of honour for their service. Another such commander is named by Polyaenus. There he records a ruse against Seleucus's generals Achaeus and Andromachus, where a Cretan officer, Philotyrus, was sent to negotiate for the body of Antiochus. Antiochus had spread a rumour that he had been killed, but when men came to take the surrender of Antiochus's forces, his troops attacked them. This seems the kind of ruse ideal for a commander of light-armed or missile troops. So Philotyrus may well have been a commander of the archers. Polybius has many references to Cretans, especially in the forces of the Diadochi and in foreign armies, without necessarily calling them Cretan archers, although it seems clear from the context that they were. By naming a unit as Cretan, he was identifying them as such. What is more, they are often on both sides of opposing combatants. Philip V had his own Cretans, who guarded the rear of his march. Philip then learnt that a force including 500 mercenary Cretans had been raised against him. In the build-up to the Battle of Raphia, Ptolemy IV had 2,000 Cretans and 1,000 Neo-Cretans, while Antiochus had 1,500 Cretans and 1,000 Neo-Cretans. Antiochus's commander of the Neo-Cretans was one Zelis of Gortyna, revealing in the army of Demetrius Polyacetes in 305 BCE. We know that there were recruitment officers in Crete, and treaties survive for cities to provide troops for Antigonus Doson. 500 Cretans in service to Hiero of Syracuse were sent, along with 1,000 peltasts, to aid Gnaeus Servilius and Gaius Flaminius during the Second Punic War. Again, it is understood that these Cretans were archers. It is entirely possible that Hiero had more Cretan archers at his disposal. Cretan archers continued to be hired by Roman commanders and their enemies. Perseus recruited 3,000 Cretans under Sillus of Knossos, but this was double what had been sent to Publius Licinius to fight him in 171 BCE. Gaius Gracchus had a contingent of Cretan archers to fight against Fulvius. Strabo records that Mithridates V appointed a certain Dorilaus to recruit mercenaries in Greece, Thrace and Crete. And Appian tells us that Caesar had Cretan archers at Brundisium ready to face Pompey. Caesar himself mentions Cretan archers, and elsewhere mentions archers without any specific origin for them. We are then safe in assuming that some of them at least were those from Crete. Elsewhere, Caesar generally mentions legions, cavalry, auxiliaries, and light armed troops in engagements, sometimes even all his forces, without specifying which units or if there were archers included. He also mentions missiles as being effective in several engagements, without specifying if they were javelin, stone or arrow, or a mixture. Again, in most cases, we would be safe in assuming that archers, and therefore Cretans, were involved. At the Battle of the Sabis, for instance, Caesar mentions that the Numidians, these could be the archers mentioned, or they might be light-armed troops mentioned elsewhere, routed along with the cavalry and slingers. The Cretans are not mentioned in this context, so we might assume they were elsewhere on the field. This has not been an exhaustive survey of all the references to Cretan archers in ancient warfare. Indeed, we have only just arrived at Julius Caesar, but it is clear that throughout the ancient world the name Cretan was synonymous with quality and cost-effectiveness. Mercenary archers and vast numbers of young men from the cities of that island, and more than likely men from elsewhere who took up the Cretan identity to form part of a unit or who were trained in the Cretan manner, were trained and then were hired as mercenary archers to all manner of armies over a vast stretch of time. Well, thank you so much again, Murray, for writing that excellent script for us. And if you would like to write a script for us, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. Thanks again to all our patrons who help make this podcast possible. And once again, if you'd like to find out more about becoming a patron, then just go to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.